So just before we get into this episode, I wanted to let you know about a new resource available on our website. The healing process after leaving an abusive relationship can be challenging to navigate. There are plenty of different resources available, but all of that choice can be overwhelming. This is the reason I decided to create a directory of trauma coaches and therapists that work with survivors of domestic violence. They are able to provide a safe space for you to share your experience while also being able to guide you through the healing process. If you'd like to view our coaching directory, just head over to our website, afterdarkpodcast.com. These are the stories of the brave, the strong, the survivors. This is the After Dark Podcast.
If you can make it through living in abuse, you can so make it through life after abuse.
You know, like you're going to push through and you've just gone through one of the worst experiences. And so if you imagine what kind of strength that takes, you're going to be okay.
But if I could even just help one person just to leave sooner, then that would be amazing.
This is episode 37 of the After Dark Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the After Dark Podcast. In this interview, I'm speaking with Dr. Michele Finneran. Michele has written a book titled Surviving Domestic Abuse that discusses the different support systems available to domestic violence survivors. So, Michele, I was wondering if you could share about how you got started writing the book.
I got the idea of writing the book when I worked in a local jail in my local community. And what I began to discover, I was working in an inmate female incarcerated women population where women would get arrested for domestic violence, anger management, and conflict resolution. It was a program unit. And so what was happening is I was doing group sessions. And the more that I did group sessions, the more I began to realize that, and speaking individually with the inmates, the female inmates, that a lot of the women that were incarcerated because of they were victims of domestic violence. And I really had a hard time just kind of wrapping my head around that concept and, thinking about, how can domestic violence victims get incarcerated for being a victim. So often it happens, and I didn't really realize how, and you don't really realize until you're working in a system or that you are in a system, the legal system of some sort. So I went to my dissertation chair at the time and I explained to her what I was coming up against, and she told me to go to the literature and see what types of supports victims or survivors have to abolish their domestic abuse relationships. And at the time of doing my dissertation, there wasn't a whole lot of research on formal or informal support. So that's where the idea and the concept began. And then what I had to do, the barrier that I ran against was trying to get actual participants to interview. So it was a phenomenological study, a qualitative study, where I interviewed 90-minute interviews on domestic violence survivors. And doing those interviews was the most eye-opening, transformative experience that I've had professionally or academically.
Yeah, so prior to this, did you have much experience within the area of domestic violence?
Not so much until I worked in that local jail. Not so much, no. I worked in community mental health centers, which, with chronically mentally ill clients, but not in a setting quite like this.
So throughout your time interviewing these survivors, did you notice any recurring themes?
When I started speaking to the survivors, what I began to realize is there was a certain criteria that I utilized to interview the participants. One of them was you had to be 18 or older. You had to have had some sort of domestic violence relationship a year or thereafter. So these are not actual victims, they're survivors. and you've had to use some sort of formal or informal supports. And when we talk about formal supports, we're talking about law enforcement, we're talking about mental health counselors, we're talking about lawyers or attorneys or judicial system, clergy or medical, anything medical staff. And then or informal supports, talking about parents, mother, father, relatives, family members, friends, coworkers, and supervisors. So I got a gist of a little bit. The barrier was trying to find participants. And what I did is I teamed up with local community mental health centers in the area and was able to facilitate participants through their help.
So did you notice that there was a specific support system that the survivors gravitated towards?
One of the biggest ones was definitely law enforcement. Law enforcement seemed to be the ones that people victims went to the first and primarily mostly to get the help they needed. There were some pros and cons to women using law enforcement as a support. One of the things that a lot of the survivors discussed was that a lot of law enforcement don't have the empathy or the sensitivity to deal with the victim population as such, and so a lot of them felt re-victimized in a way, and kind of like they weren't being taken seriously.
I was just wondering, can you share a little bit more about the formal support services?
Sure. So with the formal supports, a lot of the survivors that reached out to formal supports, their informal supports, meaning a lot of their friends recommended that they seek counseling, and the counselors that they sought were mental health counselors, and they helped them, process the goals of the therapist is to help process the victim through their trauma and allow for that processing to take place, as well as trying to strategically meet the client where they're at. And I felt like one of the things that I discovered while interviewing some of these survivors is a lot of therapists weren't really keen on doing that. They were just really quick on making a safety plan and getting them out of a dangerous relationship, rightfully so. But a lot of survivors or victims at the time weren't ready to do that as of yet. So it was challenging for the victim who was seeking the help at times, because they wanted to get the help, but they needed the therapist needed to meet them where they were at.
So did you find that there were some obstacles that the survivors had to overcome when it came time to ask for help?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I feel like there definitely were some barriers for the victims at the time to reach out for help. A lot of it is just feeling like humiliated or embarrassed that you're even in this position or in this abusive relationship. What people don't realize that it can really happen to anyone if you're not keen on the key red flags that might be present when you're dating a partner. But there was a lot of embarrassment and a feeling of a shame surrounded, which prevented women from reaching out for help. There's also like a feeling that if I'm not bleeding out or close to death, then I might not be in an abusive relationship kind of mentality. And that's really not how it really works. You can be in an abusive relationship and not have blood. And there was one I remember one survivor that I was speaking to said they were just kind of felt like little slaps of humiliation, little slaps of embarrassment, little slaps of humiliation, where there wasn't like blood, there wasn't bloodshed, but there was still emotional and physical unwarranted touch.
Yeah, I think that's so important to point out that domestic violence can be more than just physical, and it can take many forms.
Absolutely. But law enforcement and other people they need tangible evidence. So it's a very reactive system that when there is, they usually can make an arrest when there's actual like visible tangible evidence like a bruise or blood or whatever the case may be.
So, in regards to other formal support services, were there other common responses that you remember hearing throughout the interviews?
I found that a lot of times with the judicial system, they really were able, the judge was able to assess and ask the victim what she wanted to see happen, and gave her a voice and gave her kind of like a little bit of empowerment to kind of really step up and step out. And a lot of the women felt very embraced by the judicial system, who were able to have them speak as to what they wanted and needed at that time. So that was pretty helpful. In the book, excuse me, in the book, in each formal and informal support, I write down recommendations for the formal and informal supports as to if anybody is in a position where they're helping professionally or personally a victim of domestic abuse, what to say, what to do, what not to say, what not to do, what's deemed helpful, what's not. So I think those recommendations in the book were important to kind of elaborate and illustrate for the providers or the family members that were helping out in these situations.
One thing that I really appreciated when reading your book was the chapter summary that you provided. You did such a great job of explaining each support service and provided really clear and practical advice.
Thank you. It is about cleaning up the system a little bit better and making it a little bit more proficient and efficient.
I'm really glad that you were able to conduct these interviews and give a voice to domestic violence survivors.
I'm telling you, Isaac, the interviews that I did were absolutely the most profound thing I've ever done professionally or academically. Like I said before, these interviews, and they were 90-minute interviews, and they were based on a semi-structured format where I would state a question and then utilize semi-structured to follow up questions. And I'm telling you, I just felt so honored and blessed that I was able to attain participants that were willing and able to step up and step out to help make this book a possibility.
So, were there any challenges you had to overcome when it came time to start this project?
Yes, it wasn't easy because, after a month of sitting there, I was like, okay, so how is this going to happen? How am I supposed to do this? They're not going to come to me, I have to go to them. So what I did is I teamed up with local community mental health centers, a police victim advocate program. I teamed up with a sexual assault treatment center. I teamed up with just the local communities in the area where I could post my flyer, and then I would get calls, and then I would start scheduling them.
Did you find that some of the survivors would prefer to just use either formal or informal support services?
I think that's the other way around. I think there are a lot of people that were hesitant to go with their informal supports. A lot of personal embarrassment having to be connected with that. So I think it's actually the opposite, that people were, the way the victims first sought out help is they did their own kind of preliminary research, and they did their own kind of, attending of support groups, because they knew they knew something was wrong in their relationship, but they really didn't identify it as domestic abuse or domestic violence until they started hearing stories and respondents from other survivors or victims that, yes, sounds very similar and very familiar. And I feel like there's something bigger happening for me. But it wasn't like in their face. I feel like they had to do a little bit of self-discovery.
So while interviewing these survivors, did you hear a lot of different red flags in their relationships?
Yes. There were many red flags. For instance, getting into the relationship way too quickly. That was a lot of the women discussed that they, their partner were really gung ho about like meeting and then talking for a little bit and then moving right in with each other. So that was something that was a kind of like a huge red flag, that moving very fast in the relationship, which is not recommended in any relationship is to take your time and to make sure it's healthy and to get to know. So that was one of the red flags that took place. Another red flag was the survivors, the victims at the time, started seeing how controlling their partner was and how they didn't really want them to interact with really much anybody. And that was kind of the way that the perpetrator, their partner, would isolate them and alienate them from their loved ones and from their family and friends.
Yeah, I definitely noticed a similar trend when interviewing survivors as well. I often heard about how their abusive partners would relocate them to a different town and isolate them from friends and family.
I definitely agree. I think that there are definitely underlying themes. And when I did the interviews, they kind of popped out. Another interesting theme that kind of popped out was the mother-daughter relationship, and how important, I didn't really realize this until I did the interviews, how important a parent, a mother, to have emotionally secured attachment to their daughters, and what that actually does for the daughter's future intimate partner relationships. Didn't really realize that. I thought it would be the father and the daughter, but actually it's the same-sex parent that really made all the difference.
And so was that a recurring theme that you noticed throughout the interviews?
Yes. So what the participants were saying, the survivors were saying that they did most of them, all of them actually did not have healthy emotional bonding with their mothers. And that an insecure attachment led them into the arms of their perpetrator as they expressed and as they felt. Like the mothers were there in different ways. They were there physically, they were there maybe monetarily or babysitting or helping them move or go to appointments, but emotionally not available to their daughters. And a lot of daughters that were witnessed their mothers in victimization, and how that kind of unfolded, and that learning of that learned helplessness in families, and kind of learning that and taking that as a part of their own future relationships.
Did you notice any trends in terms of the survivors' home environment growing up?
Yes. That there was many times where there was a dysfunction with the family of origin, where the parents, where the daughter learned through the mother kind of victimization through just being exposed to it growing up in her childhood.
So when the survivors were speaking about their abusive partners, did you notice any similarities in terms of their characteristics?
Oh yeah. So very similar, very similar. I would just say the biggest similarity were pretty much narcissistic personality disorders. And, it's funny because with a lot of the perpetrators, they were like nice to and friendly and charismatic to everybody else around them except their partner. So no one really knew that there were issues going on, or the perpetrator was actually a perpetrator because of the facade that the male put on. So I felt like a lot of the survivors often had perpetrators that had this kind of like chauvinistic, egotistical, narcissistic kind of mentality, where they were friendly to everybody else around them, neighbors, what have you. But when they stepped inside the home and interacted with their partner, they were the most abusive.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed similarities as well as I've been interviewing survivors for the podcast. Even though each person is different, they still share so many similar personality traits.
Isn't it so strange? Like, I feel like it's very strange. Like there's obviously they're different, but still, like we said before, there's this underlying theme of similarity that just streams through, even with the perpetrator's character traits.
So I was wondering if you can share a little bit more about the informal support services that you speak about in the book, and if the survivors had any obstacles to overcome in this area.
Yes. Well, One of the things that you would think that would that again popped out in the interviews that I didn't think would is something that was not helpful that parents, mom and dad, did when their daughters would come to them and help and needing help from them is the bashing of the perpetrator is just not helpful for the victim going through abuse. I wouldn't think that to be significant, but it certainly was when I did the interviews and I interviewed these survivors that one of the things that they felt that was not helpful that their parents did was emotionally tear down because also the survivor, the victim at the time, had a sense of wanting to protect their perpetrator emotionally, physically. And that's when we talked about in the book the Stockholm syndrome, where you feel the need to protect the perpetrator. And that's why for law enforcement, domestic violence calls are so dangerous for law enforcement because the victim calls law enforcement for protection. The law enforcement officer comes out and makes the arrest for the perpetrator, but then the domestic violence victim attacks a law enforcement officer for arresting the perpetrator. And a lot of it has to do with just, the victim's fear of retaliation or more abuse or, them getting out in 3 or 4 days and then having to face the repercussions of making that call. Have you heard of anything like that during your podcasting?
No, I haven't heard that kind of situation occurring with the survivors that I've interviewed, but I do ask if they can share how they eventually left the relationship. I have found, though, that most of the survivors have a plan in place so that when the opportunity arises, they can seize the moment and escape the relationship.
What I found is that escape time, and that we call what therapists do that with their clients, they develop a safety plan. That escape time, when that window period when there is time to escape, is for the victim the most dangerous time for them physically, because now they're gone or they've left, and now the retaliation and the wanting to get back at the victim is heightened now.
So do you think that this comes back to an issue of the abuser losing control of the situation?
Yes, it's a definitely, with domestic violence, there is definitely the power and control wheel that is very prevalent in this situation, yes.
It must be so challenging to be in that situation when you've got to have a plan to escape the person that's supposed to love you.
Yeah, it's very challenging. And, when law enforcement go to these houses for when they get these calls, they have a very hard time wrapping their head around why do I keep coming back to this house? Why do I keep having this? Why do we keep having the same situation? And it's that traumatic emotional bonding that the perpetrator and the victim have with each other that creates such a problem for women to leave. And that's why it's really not a fair comment when people say, why don't you just leave him? Why don't you just go? It's just there's so many components that manifest that make it not just one simple answer as to why you can't just leave. A lot of it is an emotional attachment as to why they are unable to break free.
Did you find that some of the survivors had attempted to leave the relationship multiple times?
Absolutely. The average of that is about eight attempts of trying to actually leave, and then so the average used to be 7, and now it's 8. Yeah, research has shown.
Were there any other things that stood out when you were researching the informal support services?
What was really helpful if there was an informal support that also acted as a formal support, like a family or a friend that was in law enforcement, or a family or a friend that was a counselor, or a family and friend that was an attorney. That was very helpful because they got the best of both worlds, right? They got an informal support that was also a professional support as well. So that was very helpful. I had one survivor to discuss how when she worked at the law firm, she was very hesitant about speaking to her boss. And her peers and her coworkers tried to encourage her too. But when she did, he was super helpful in helping her legally guide her down the right road. So that's very helpful when an informal support, whether it be a family, a friend, a relative, a coworker, a supervisor is also a formal support.
So I normally ask this question to the survivors of domestic violence that I interview, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective on it. What kind of advice would you give to somebody that is in a relationship with a survivor of domestic violence?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, that question has never been posed to me. I just feel like having the survivor, obviously you don't want to create and have old relationships bleed into new ones. So if the partner is discovering that there is some bleed into their relationship, asking and discussing, maybe getting some help so the relationship that they're in can be actually healthy moving forward. And just being patient. And a lot of women don't want to disclose everything that's happened in their past to their current partners, and rightfully so. It's kind of like, again, that seeking out for help and omitting all these things that have happened to you, but just being patient and realizing that some of these things might come up in your current relationship, and to try to recommend if it gets to a point where knowing when to need professional help.
And then what advice would you give to somebody that might be currently in an abusive relationship?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. A person, a victim will, they'll know that when it's time for them to eradicate their abusive relationship. No one can really tell anybody what to do. Even formal supports can't really tell somebody who's not ready what to do. So I guess the best advice I could give is do your due diligence and try to research and talk to other people. And obviously, if there's an instant or intuitive feeling that something is wrong, then you might want to tap into that a little bit deeper. As a therapist myself, as a clinician, you obviously want your clients to err on the side of caution, and safety. So, if they're not emotionally or physically ready to make that move, work with them until they are.
So just before we wrap things up, I was wondering if there was anything else that you would like to share.
No, but the questions, Isaac, that you have raised that were, no one's ever posed them to me before. It's really, really, really insightful questions. And it takes me a minute to kind of take a step back and really process and think about the question, especially if it's never been asked, or the way that you asked it was amazing. Yeah. So I feel like there's just, making sure that it's, especially like during this pandemic, it has, the domestic abuse rates have really skyrocketed. And so I want people to know that, the book right now serves a very, very big purpose in not just abolishing your relationship, but also helping those who are in an abusive relationship.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story of hope. If you know of anyone that might be struggling with domestic violence, please feel free to share this podcast with them. If you believe in the value of sharing these stories and would like to donate to show your support, I'd really appreciate it. To find out more about donating, please visit afterdarkpodcast.com/donate. So, until next time, my name is Isaac Marano, and this is the After Dark Podcast.